branding is not as clear within the wine category. The people look at countries, varietals. We don't really know about the actual producer and the brand of wine. And consumers take confidence in brands, strong brands, be that in fashion, be that in cars, be that in whatever. They choose a brand. The reality of the economics will drive consolidation. Players will just go bankrupt. Even in France, the government can't support every single producer forever. And it has to face a harsh economic reality that says you can't have this number of people producing wine that is not being consumed and bought by consumers. Tariffs have existed for decades, centuries. So it's not like tariffs are a new thing. Yet the industry has grown despite those tariffs. So do I think tariffs are the death knell of the industry? Absolutely not. Do they cause short-term blips because they push prices up? Yes, they do. But producers find ways of solving that particular challenge. Either they move production to a different location, or ultimately a new political environment comes in that doesn't believe in tariffs and removes them anyway. So they cause blips and they cause economic challenges in the short term, but they're not going to be the end of consumption.
This is Dolia Talks with me, Giovanni Binello. Now, Dolia Talks is a show where we discuss with the best sales and marketing professionals in the world of wine, spirits, and in general, beverages. Our guest today is Chris Caldwell. Now, Chris has spent almost 30 years working in the food and beverage industry, serving as CFO at Enotria and global CEO at Stoli. Chris is one of the most knowledgeable people I know in the industry, and in this conversation, we explored why wine has a branding problem, how wineries can work with distributors, and how you can set up your export strategy to work in countries like the United Arab Emirates. So this was a truly great conversation. I hope you enjoyed the show, and as always, remember to subscribe, and if you have any feedback or suggestions, feel free to write an email at giovanni@getdolia.com. So hello Chris, and welcome to Dolia Talks.
Hi Giovanni, how are you doing?
Very good, thank you. So I would like to start this interview from some conversations I had in the past weeks with a lot of people actually involved in the wine industry, because everyone, and also if you read the news, I think it's a bit everywhere. It seems like the wine market is drastically declining. People speak about crisis, and the French wine is in deep crisis. So do you actually think this is true, or do you think actually people are exaggerating also compared to maybe the past and past trends?
I think most people in the alcohol world are panicked about that sort of question, to be honest with you, Giovanni. And to be frank, for the wine sector, it's not a recent phenomenon. Decline has been around for a good number of years now in wine. And there's a whole series of reasons why that is the case. For example, the growth and popularity of other drinks in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. Spirits have done incredibly well, either through cocktails or just through really, really strong branding. RTDs, likewise, have made big inroads and grown successfully and taken young consumers, particularly young consumers, which is an issue for many categories and wine, certainly. If you don't have recruitment constantly going on in your sector, the sector is going to face issues at some point in time. And that's a big issue for wine, amongst other drinks. The other thing that's going on at the moment, and this is in different pockets of the world, US particularly, but recently with the legalization of cannabis and CBD, that has become a really viable alternative for consumers. Females particularly seem to be moving that way because there's far less calories associated with that particular consumption versus, for example, wine. Health and wellness is a big trend that's been going on across the world. People are genuinely taking more note now of what they put into their bodies, be that in lower sugars or in less ultra processed things. But equally, it's about other things like alcohol. And wine is definitely feeling the impacts of that particular trend that have been going on. Economic factors, as always, hurt. We're in a down cycle at the moment, and that started a number of years ago when inflation consumption spiked and people's pockets got squeezed. And let's not kid ourselves, going out either for a drink or for dinner is a discretionary item. And when people's pockets get squeezed, they stop drinking as much or stop going out as much. And I think the other thing that the wine particularly faces in comparison to some of the other sectors is I don't think the industry has necessarily, over the last 10 years or so, done enough to make the category simple, attractive, appealing, and relevant for consumers, and particularly for younger consumers to come into the category. Others have done far better jobs at that. And as a result, wine has lost out. Wine is still a confusing category. How do you know what a good quality wine is? There aren't the same sort of standards and consistency that you see in other categories like spirits or beer. Branding is not as clear within the wine category. The people look at countries, varietals. We don't really know about the actual producer and the brand of wine. And consumers take confidence in brands, strong brands, be that in fashion, be that in cars, be that in whatever. They choose a brand. And if wine hasn't put forward a very compelling brand proposition, then it becomes really confusing. What do you go for? And then availability is not always a great strength of the wine industry because there's so much choice. How do you get your product to be available everywhere? And if somebody does do a bit of research, and younger consumers particularly like to research what they want to buy, and then they go out and can't find it, they're not going to, they'll go for something different. And you mentioned before that, kind of overproduction has happened and it's continued to happen within wine. I don't think the industry has scaled back and recognized this structural change that's been going on. And that doesn't help because you then have a glut of wine that's out there that goes into cheaper outlets, and that harms the quality side of the sector again and just further makes things more challenging. So there's definitely a lot for the sector to get its head around and work out how it's going to address this in order to turn it around. Do I think that people kind of obviously panic and get emotional about it? Of course they do. And I understand the passion, I understand the livelihoods that are at risk, but you've got to actually step back and say, how do we address them? Let's not just kind of get into panic mode. Let's think about the best way to address all of this. And I don't think the industry's done a good enough job at that, to be honest.
And you mentioned spirits before. So taking all of what you said, so branding,
Yeah.
availability, making yourself a bit more known, even and closer to young consumers. Do you think spirits did a better job at that? And if yes, how and what do you think wine can actually learn from what the spirits industry did?
So for sure, I think that they've done a much better job. I mean, if you look back to a couple of strong examples, Earl Spritz would be a great example. It's probably done as big a job as anything at harming the wine sector consumption, because the Spritz occasion took over a lot of what was traditionally a wine consumption occasion, and they've really marketed that brand very well at younger consumers. They've got themselves into the occasions where young consumers are frequenting, be that events, sports, music, whatever, but they're always there, they're always available, they're always talking to those consumers, they're making it vibrant, attractive, bright, relevant. The messaging is something that resonates with younger consumers. If you think about lots of other brands over the last 20 years that have done similar things, in the US, Tito's in vodka, it's the biggest selling vodka in the United States, by far overtook Absolut and Smirnoff on a very American base, but a message that was relevant for Americans. Whereas, Smirnoff is a global brand, Absolut is a global brand. It wasn't quite as in tune with what America was wanting from branding at that point in time. So there are plenty of examples that you can look at where they've done a really great job, and wine hasn't followed suit because it's been too fragmented and there hasn't been that attempt to really build a very strong brand. The brands that stand out are unfortunately the old world brands, and they're too expensive and too exclusive for many consumers to access. So you can't really say, well, that's a great example, because most consumers can't afford or can't get those particular well-known brands and chateaus.
And so Because I was thinking, no? Usually when you read also some articles or a lot of LinkedIn influencer, they say, okay, wineries should work on the website, they should work on their branding. Look at what, as you said, Aperol Spritz is doing. There's a lot of now no alcohol brands
Yep.
or aperitifs that do like this very beautiful
Mm.
branding exercises. But then if all wineries, let's say in an ideal world, all wineries, let's say, rethink their branding and go in that direction of a more modern and closer to the young generations branding, then we would have the same issue, no? Because we will still have this hugely fragmented market, only with more beautiful labels, probably. So, my curiosity and a question that I ask myself is, what's actually the solution? Is
Yeah.
it actually working on the label, working on the logos, on the brand, or maybe there's, as you said, we need a consolidation of the industry in some way?
Yeah, I'd perhaps just take a little bit of an exception to what you said. The branding is not just the logo. It's not just the label. Branding is the entire proposition that a consumer interacts with. You know, what is the proposition? What is that brand standing for? What is it that they're communicating to a consumer? And then how does it look and feel? And how available is it? Is the quality of the right order that would be expected from a consumer when they get the whole proposition? So the label and the logo are just one element, and it's a relatively small element. You actually have to get the other connection moments and reasons to believe stories out there to make sure that consumers genuinely buy into. And these days, younger consumers are very good at researching. They see through marketing hype, and the old kind of marketing ways are having to be rethought and redone. And that's something that you know wine has got to do. How do you build a wine brand that's relevant these days to a younger consumer to make them want to purchase it and have it part of their repertoire on a regular basis, that makes says something about them that they believe is important and relevant. And that's really what I mean when I say branding hasn't been a strong point of the wine industry. They focus more on, we make a great wine, it's this particular varietal, it's from this particular region, it's out of this chateau. And they make more about that and the quality element, which is important, but it's not the only thing. And they haven't done enough to build the other stories and elements around that really connect with and resonate with consumers. So for me, that's an important thing that they need to get their heads around. And you're right, there's still a massive fragmentation that's out there. And I think, like many industries, some degree of consolidation is going to have to happen. I look at what happened. I use a spirit category again as an example. Gin, you know, 5, 10 years ago, gin had a massive explosion, a regeneration. It had been a bit of a boring category that was plodding along for a long time. And suddenly, all of these craft distilleries came through and were producing very different flavor profiles, and then different color variants of gin came in. And suddenly it became a new and exciting category again for people. And because, you know, people at that point in time weren't necessarily as confident with cocktails, a gin and tonic was seen as a simple cocktail to have. And because the gins all had so much flavor in them, it did become like a cocktail, even just by adding tonic, because all the flavors of the gin came through and gave you a much broader experience than just a simple spirit like a vodka, for example. So, you know, that was an example of an explosion and fragmentation. In the last few years, as gin has kind of lost some of its cachet, you see people are slimming down on the ranges again. You do see that some of those small craft distilleries have either been acquired or they have just gone out of business because there isn't enough demand to keep them. As supermarkets have, you know, velocity thresholds. If you don't turn over a certain number of bottles on a shelf, you don't stay listed in a supermarket for that long. And whilst they were keen to take advantage of this explosion, they rapidly consolidated afterwards when they became shelf warmers, as the industry calls them. So you've seen that happen in other categories, and I think wine is going to have to face up to that at some point in time. That you can't necessarily have the degree of fragmentation.
And what do you think could actually happen? So would it be like the existing large groups that go and purchase smaller wineries or smaller producers that maybe come together and create completely new brands from like larger companies from smaller brands. So what do you think will actually happen here?
I think it's probably a combination of both. If I look at the industry at the moment, a lot of the bigger players are actually genuinely looking at wine and going, what do we do? And you're seeing a number of the traditional big wine players exit the wine industry and sell off and focus on other categories, which has been a route that perhaps, 5 or so years ago, we may not have thought would happen, because normally consolidation is driven by the big players. But the big players are seeing the challenges and going, I don't know how I can drive this change. And their shareholders, unfortunately, haven't got patience. So they don't have the luxury of time that perhaps a different route of consolidation could offer. I think, coming together with medium players or small players is definitely going to be happening alongside some other consolidation, perhaps by one or two committed big players who could drive the sort of change. I also think that the reality of the economics will drive consolidation. Players will just go bankrupt. Even in France, the government can't support every single producer forever, and it has to face a harsh economic reality that says you can't have, this number of people producing wine that is not being consumed and bought by consumers.
And this considered, if let's say if you were a small producer, or if you were, I don't know, considering about launching your wine brand, or you inherited a winery for some reason, what would you actually do? I mean, does it make sense to be on your own? What do you think would be the best approach for a small producer that maybe has just started, a young person that is just entering the industry?
There are great examples in wine of the small players doing well. I look at Champagne as an example, and there are plenty of small producers in the Champagne region who are producing phenomenal champagnes, better than the big branded ones, to be honest, much better than the big branded ones. And I think as if you can see that sort of success and connect with the right sort of outlets, I think you've got to be ruthless these days about what your proposition is, where you want to be, and who you want to reach. And then you have to go after that very, very clinically. Work with the right distribution partners. Focus on the right sales channels. Recognize that you're not going to be a multi-million case brand, and go for what you want to achieve. Clear goals, clear measures. So I think you've got to be really clear, focused before you set out. And if I was, kind of either inheriting or starting now, I would do that. I'd start out with an absolutely crystal clear plan of what we want to be, both in terms of a brand and a business, and then clinically go after that and don't change. A lot of businesses, they sniff a little bit of success, and they think it's going to, and they suddenly change, and then they lose it and they wonder what happened. And I just don't think the industry's ripe for that sort of situation anymore.
How do you recognize actually the right distributor? Because you said you need to find the right distributor. So how can actually I decide,
Yeah.
or how can I evaluate if I found the right one?
I think there's a number of criteria, Giovanni, that you need to think about. First of all is, what is your brand proposition and where do you think your consumers are? And then you've got to look at which distributors reach those sorts of outlets where your consumers are going to be. Don't go to a big distributor who only really services supermarkets if your consumers are in cocktail bars. You're never going to achieve success. So you've got to think about what it is that your brand is standing for and where the consumers of that brand are going to be, and then which is the best distributor to fit with that. The second thing you should always think about is, which distributor has values the same as my company's. Because if you don't have similar values, you don't have similar philosophies, you don't have similar outlooks on how to achieve the goals you want, then in all honesty, it's going to break down at some point. You think about how do you select a partner in life? You look at the fit you both have. You look at the qualities and characteristics and the values that you both have, the commonalities and the differences. And that's what we do when we select partners. We go through that process, sometimes subliminally, sometimes not. But we do it, and you should do that with your distribution partners as well, because otherwise the relationship is never going to be straightforward, honest, and transparent. So that would be another criteria to think about. And then I always kind of look at, capabilities and passion. What capabilities do they have that I don't have that means that we complement each other? What sort of level of passion do they have? Because a lot of companies are what are known as brand adders. They just add and add and add brands into their portfolio. And that's not really what you want. You want companies who are passionate about the sector, your brand, what it can do, the consumers, the outlets, and you want to feel that passion. And it is a feeling. You know it when you go out with the people into the trade, be it in on or off trade or through digital channels, what level of passion they have just by talking to them.
And on the other side, for a distributor perspective, what do they look for in producers before they choose to partner with them?
So most distributors, and this genuinely is through lots of experience of talking to distributors, they'll tell you that most companies don't really know what they want. And they're not very clear, therefore. So they never set clear goals, or they set goals in the simple sense of maybe cases sold, as opposed to the quality of distribution, the number of visibility points, the things that really matter to building your brand, to making it successful. So clarity is something that distributors look for from producers. And if the producer doesn't have clarity, clear thinking, clear goals, clear strategies, clear branding propositions, then they lose confidence. So that would be one thing. So real crystal clear clarity. Second thing is, do you have the ability to work with and invest behind the brand in the way that the distributor can deal with alongside you, that has a chance of making you successful and achieving the sort of goals that both of you want? If you don't have that wherewithal and it's down purely to them and their pockets, then it's kind of like it's not an equal partnership for one, and it's unlikely to achieve its goals for two. So they look for, do you have the ability to achieve what you say you want to achieve? And finally, they also look for the fit elements as well. So do they have a similar outlook on life and how to do business as we do? Are they going to be open and transparent and honest with us? Can we have frank conversations with them to say, we don't think that's right? And they'll listen to us rather than go, we're the brand owner, you do what we tell you to do. So they want that kind of fit alongside them as well. And they assess you on the same criteria as I've just described you should think about for a distribution partner.
And I'm lucky enough to speak to a lot of people in the industry, and a lot of producers actually. I ask the question, do you know how much wine did you sell in Milan or in London or whatever? And they tell me, no, I have actually no idea because distributors don't really give us the data. So how do you think actually distributors and producers can communicate more effectively? Because it seems to me from the conversations I had, there's really a gap from between what the distributors do and what the producers get as information from distributors. So do you think there's actually an issue there in the communication, or do you think there's some better way of doing it?
I think in all honesty, it comes down to the clarity point again, Giovanni. If you're clear with your distributor what you want to achieve and what information you need regularly to track progress towards that, then they give it to you. Genuinely, I've not seen anyone who tries to be difficult and tries to be underhand and hold back information from you. But very often, producers, particularly in certain sectors of the alcohol world, craft beer is an example, as well as wine, they're not clear enough about what information needs they have. And therefore, distributors don't give them anything because they're not being asked for it. And very often they also work through a model that isn't a direct model. So let me explain what I mean by that. They may have an importer to a country, but then that importer uses lots of sub-distributors to make sure it gets into the marketplace. And if you're not being clear all through the chain, what is expected information-wise and what goals need to be achieved, then it will not flow back up that chain. And the importer won't get the information, and therefore the producer won't get the information. So you've got to be clear about your go-to-market model, what success criteria looks like, and then how you're going to track and measure it, and explain that right up front. Put that in clear KPIs or put it in your contract, to be honest. And then no one can back away from it because you have either a marketing plan that says you will give me this monthly report, we will sit down together and review it every single month or weekly, whatever the frequency is, quarterly business reviews. You can ask for all these things. They're all geared up to do it. But if you don't ask and you don't specify, you won't get.
Do you think this model will remain the dominant one? And I mean, let's say the three-tier model that was born in the US? Or do you think there will be in the coming years maybe a shift towards direct sales? So, what do you think will happen in terms of sales channels
Yeah.
and distribution models?
So I think we need to look at the US separate from other parts of the world because the three-tier model is legislated in the US and legislation is much harder to change than free market dynamics. So if I look at Europe, where free market dynamics typically exist, the online platforms have all grown pretty nicely over the last 5 years to 10 years, particularly since COVID. Interestingly enough, they exploded, settled down since then, but they'll continue steady growth. There's no doubt about that. The challenge the alcohol sector has with an online model, and this is not to say that I don't believe it won't continue to grow. I do believe it will continue to grow, but I think that there are limits to it, unlike other categories of fashion or whatever else. And the reason I say that is one, alcohol is a controlled product and you have to be a certain age to buy it. So the sector has to be able to provide a means by which governments of countries are comfortable that underage people are not accessing alcohol. Most countries now in Europe have some form of advertising restrictions for alcohol as well, which means online platforms become more difficult because if you can't advertise, how do you actually communicate to a consumer about it and how do you encourage them? The other element that's got its challenges, not insurmountable, but they are challenges, are the weight and fragility. Glass is breakable and it's heavy. So delivery is not as cheap and easy as sending a dress or a shirt to somebody's house. And returnability is very difficult in the alcohol sector, whereas returnability in fashion, it's a doddle. So I think that there are challenges that the sector has that some other sectors don't have that may see a limit to some of it. And I also think the other thing that is different is alcohol tends to come with socialization. And you're socializing when you consume it very often, and that's not going to change. Human beings need contact, they need human interactions and socialization, and that will always remain an important part of the consumer occasion. So going out to a bar or a pub to meet your friends, celebrate somebody's birthday, or whatever else it is that you're connecting on. Maybe you've had a crap week and you just want to go out with your mates and get over the crap week. That's not going to change, which means that you're always going to have this channel demand there. That means that online can't overtake everything.
Changing a bit the subject because we spoke about distribution before, and in terms of foreign markets.
Yeah.
So now, of course, the buzz is all around the tariffs and the effect of the tariffs. I think we don't have yet the right data to say are they working or not. But so first of all, my question would be, what do you think going forward will actually be the true effect of those tariffs on the market? Because even there, people are panicking. But are they right to be panicking or not?
Tariffs have existed for, I don't know, decades, centuries, whatever it is. India had huge tariff barriers in place until quite recently, and it still has them in place, but it is loosening them off as it signs more and more trade deals with other countries. So it's not like tariffs are a new thing, and yet the industry has grown despite those tariffs. So do I think tariffs are the death knell of the industry? Absolutely not. Do they cause short-term blips because they push prices up? Yes, they do. But producers find ways of solving that particular challenge. Either they move production to a different location where the tariffs are either lower or non-existent, or ultimately a new political environment comes in that doesn't believe in tariffs and removes them anyway. So, I just don't see tariffs are a long-term death knell for the industry. They cause blips and they cause economic challenges in the short term, but they're not going to be the end of consumption.
And in terms of, so you mentioned India, do you think there are new export markets that will actually emerge for European wine
Huge.
and also in general also for spirits?
Yeah, huge, huge. I mean, you look at how alcohol production never mind consumption, has evolved over the last 10 or 15 years. And you see the quality of wines coming out of countries either in Eastern Europe or in other parts of the world that didn't perhaps have the heritage of winemaking, the likes of France or the other European countries did have. And they're now doing really, really well. You know, the quality of those products is great. It's the same in spirits. You know, you look at the spirit production that's coming out of Australia, out of China, out of India itself, and they're all going up and up and up in quality. No longer do certain old world economies hold the purse strings, if you like, on those categories. And I think as that production evolves, what happens is consumers get more and more attuned to better products, and they start looking around the world as well and go, okay, well, if this is now really good, what else is there I can try? And as they start to develop a bit more wealth themselves and they travel and they experience other products, they want to bring that home and experience it there as well. So there's no doubt about it that the world has immense opportunities yet in new markets for products that perhaps haven't had those opportunities historically. But equally for products coming from those parts of the world, to established areas of the world for alcohol consumption.
Do you think in Europe we are ready to accept actually these foreign products, or are we too in love with our own products?
France is, if I remember rightly, the biggest brown spirit market in the whole of Europe. And that's not all coming from French products. It's coming from lots and lots of other products. It's also the biggest rum market in Europe. So I think there's plenty of evidence that European consumers are well up for experimentation and trying new things. Sometimes they have particular viewpoints on certain parts of the world, but as the younger consumers experience those products, it quickly overcomes that viewpoint. And typically, I can say this being one of that generation, it's typically older generations that hold those viewpoints.
One other thing I'm hearing is the Middle East is the next super large export market for wine. And what do you think about that? I know you also had an experience in the Middle East or
Yeah,
in your past. So
I've
what was your...
lived there twice. Back
Okay.
in the early 2000s and then again in end of the teens, so 2017 to just before the pandemic. So I've seen the development of that part of the world firsthand. And I know when I first lived out there, wine was not particularly big, not particularly popular. Clearly at restaurants it was, but not necessarily everywhere else. And a large part of the consumption of that was really from the expat community. Now I look at how wine has developed, and you've got a business model like Le Clos, where you can order online, go on a flight, which is a pretty regular thing when you live in the Middle East. You come back from your flight and your wine is waiting there for you, and it's good quality wine. And it's from all over the world. So even in the time span between my spells living in the Middle East, the wine industry had already penetrated and done a much, much better job. I do think there's a long way to go yet. It's not got into the larger expat communities to the same extent. I mean, there's large communities of Filipino people living in the Middle East. There's large communities of the Indian subcontinent that live in the Middle East as well. And, penetrating that community, or those communities, I should say, more successfully will open up big opportunities for wine.
So let's say we are advising as consultants a young Italian producer and he wants or she wants to export to the Middle East. So what do you think needs to be considered for that market? Because my guess is that, and also I've been there recently as well, my guess is it's completely different from European markets
It
in
is.
terms of how people live and how wine gets sold. So what do you think are the key elements to be considered for a winery or a producer in general that wants to export
Yeah.
to that market?
I'd go back to what I said earlier, clarity of purpose, clarity of proposition, clarity of what you want to achieve. Your choice and route to market is vastly limited in comparison to other parts of the world. There are only two distribution companies, African and Eastern, and MMI, Mercantile. The other difference in the Middle East is that you can only sell alcohol in the licensed premises, which are typically hotels. Hotels are the only licensed venues in the Middle East, and the restaurants within those hotels, restaurants and bars, I should say, are the only venues can sell in the hotel. It's not widely available for sale in there. There are off-license type premises, a liquor permit to be able to purchase alcohol from them, but it's a limited number and it's based upon your salary. typically. So there are differences that you have to understand in the dynamics of route to market and how do you access consumers. But fundamentally, it still comes back to what am I trying to be? What is my proposition I need to communicate to consumers? How do I deal with the restriction on communications? Because advertising clearly is not allowed for alcohol. So how do I reach consumers in the right way? How do I make sure I'm in the right influential outlets? Be that a restaurant, be that a bar. What are the goals I'm trying to achieve? And how do I work with one of those two distributors to get to that? And then the rules of the game follow very much the pattern of everywhere else in the world. You just got to understand the go-to-market model is different.
And let's come back in general to internationalization and exports. I spoke to a lot of smaller brands that tell me, okay, yeah, in Italy or in France, my market is pretty small, but I sell a lot to Australia, I sell a lot to Asia, I sell a lot in different countries. So does it make sense to, I don't know, create a wine brand and focus it entirely on international markets? So where does the needle stand between the local market and the international market for European producers in these like large producing countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think to some extent it depends upon what your brand proposition is all about. If you're basing your brand proposition on Italian provenance, Italian heritage, to have no basis in Italy, I think weakens the proposition to your overseas consumers. Because consumers these days do travel. And if you get an Australian who comes to Italy for holiday and can't find the brand anywhere, then they go, is this really an Italian brand? Or is it just someone who's producing bulk wine and then it gets bottled up and shipped off to other parts of the world? And it's not really an Italian brand at all. So I think, depending on what your proposition is, the degree of having a home base is more or less relevant. There are a lot of brands in the alcohol world, in spirits particularly, in all honesty, that don't have a strong heritage in their own country. And they seem to have gotten around that. I think of vodkas, these days, most of the big vodkas don't have necessarily a strong home base or any home base of any note, to be frank. And they've managed to overcome that. But I don't think that they're drawing off their provenance and heritage anymore. They're building off a completely different proposition. And that doesn't require that kind of centering in your home. Wine is a little different because everybody talks about the elements of the soil, the climate, the water, the terroir. And terroir is so much more important in the wine industry than it is in spirits, to be frank. Certain spirits not, and I'd hate people to jump on the bandwagon and go down my throat for that. Terroir is really important in certain spirits categories. But in wine, it's kind of fundamental. So I think ignoring your home base is probably not going to be the wisest choice you can make. You don't have to be big everywhere in Italy, but at least make yourself available in the region you originate from.
Okay, good. So now I would move towards the conclusion of the interview. I have this section I call quick fire. So it's basically where I ask you some not related questions between each other, and it's really quick questions, and I would like to get a really quick answer in a few
Yep.
few sentences. So it's really a very quick exchange. So let's say you wake up tomorrow and you get an email where you inherited a winery. And this winery has a lot of budget, a lot of tradition. It's a very traditional brand. It has, let's say, a big market already. Which will be the first three things you do tomorrow morning?
I'd first of all look at the clarity point, clarity of proposition, clarity of strategy, clarity of go-to-market. Secondly, I'd look at the current performance of the business. Was it actually achieving the things that we set out to achieve? And if not, what do we need to correct? And thirdly, I would make sure I've got the right go-to-market partners, distribution partners, and channels. Because if you're trying to build your brand in an on-trade environment, but all your distribution is in the off-trade, then you've got something fundamentally wrong, and you're not going to be successful. So you've got to look at your channel strategy and make sure that that's right. And then genuinely, once you've got those three things absolutely crystal clear, you go after them without any change. You've got to be completely focused.
Do you think we will see in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years, a new major wine brand coming out of digital channels? So a brand born on TikTok or on Instagram that takes the market by storm and becomes one of the biggest companies in the world.
Never say never because I guarantee that that channel will surprise everybody, but I don't see that easily because of the distribution challenges that we talked about earlier. It's not a free accessible product, and you can't get it everywhere in the world easily. There are so many legal restrictions placed upon the alcohol category that having a central base and trying to distribute it through online channels to every country in the world really hard.
Do you think the sales department and marketing department talk to each other enough in
No,
beverage brands?
never. Not in my experience. Never.
Okay. And okay, then let's go a bit of on this line. What do you think that causes? I mean, what's the main problems that originate from this lack of alignment?
I think sometimes what you find is marketing departments don't necessarily get out and understand the marketplaces well enough, and therefore they think they have the right answers and don't want to listen to what the sales teams are telling them. So you end up with friction, and friction always causes a breakdown of communication. Secondly, sales departments often have very fixed views on this is how the market works, this is what you have to do. If we're not offering discounts, then we won't be competitive. And that undermines the actual brand itself if you start discounting what is meant to be a premium brand. So I think you've got to very quickly understand what the perspectives, viewpoints of each of the various departments are. And then as a leader in the business, not as someone necessarily in marketing or sales, a leader in the business, is find a way of making the two talk to each other much more effectively, work together much more effectively and cohesively, get them out in the field together. There's nothing better than getting them both out in the field and going, this is exactly what's going on. This is how your brand is showing up. This is what we're doing.
Where do you see alcohol sales heading in the next 10 years? What do you think will change? Where do you think the new markets will be? Let's do a summary of what we said.
Parts of the world that kind of are genuinely growing rapidly now: Latin America, India, China, and other parts of Asia. Huge amounts of growth still. There's economic challenges right now that have perhaps slowed some of that, but fundamentally they've got the biggest opportunities, those three parts of the world. And that's where the growth is going to continue to come from. And wine is not as well represented in most of those as it should be.
Which is a key behavior from the younger generations, let's say the Gen Z, that is being vastly underestimated by the beverage industry.
I don't think the industry at the moment understands sufficiently well how to communicate to Gen Z consumers and the next generation after that. They focus for far too long on other generations, and what works with them doesn't work with the new younger consumers. They don't understand channels of communication well enough. They don't understand what matters, the importance of health and wellness. Is this something that is really central to Gen Zers, or is it something they say is that important to them? But they're not as yet cracking that, and therefore they're not recruiting Gen Zers into the trade anywhere near at the pace they have done in other consumer groups.
So complete this sentence, the wine industry would be much better off if it stopped doing
fragmentation and old school thinking.
Nice. The last one, this is actually one I ask to everyone because it's useful for me. You invite me at dinner, what are we drinking?
Knowing my background, we would probably go to a nice cocktail bar first and have a cocktail to start, and then a meal. And genuinely depends on what your food preferences are as to what style of wine we would have with that.
Let's say your favorite one then.
Oh man, I find that such a difficult question to answer because I've got so many favorite wines out there. Favorite whites will be undoubtedly Burgundy, but in reds, lots of places around the world, to be honest with you.
Fantastic. Chris, it's been a true pleasure. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks, Giovanni. It's been great talking to you. Take care.